He was ruthless, determined, and lethal in battle. He was one of the greatest military tacticians the world has ever known. A brilliant strategist, his men gladly fought for him and died for him. All for the greater glory of Greece. He was Alexander the Great. In the 4th century BC, Alexander ruled more than half the known world. Ever hungry to expand his empire, Alexander looked towards his latest conquest, India. All that stood in the Greeks' way were 2 huge rivers and 750,000 Indian soldiers. In 331 BC, at the Battle of Arbela, nearly 50,000 Greeks fought their longtime enemies, the Persians. For hundreds of years, these 2 superpowers had been at each other's throats. The Greeks were outnumbered 2 to 1, but on this October day they emerged victorious and changed the course of history. The Greeks' victory was thanks to the tactical brilliance of their 25-year-old commander, Alexander the Great. His time had come.
Alexander has this kind of larger-than-life aura about him. He's handsome with a muscular build, and he's extremely charismatic. His troops pretty much worship him.
In less than 5 years, he had managed to carry out a major strategic plan from Greece to invade Persia and destroy the Persian Empire. In 5 years, he managed to suppress his own domestic opposition, and then finally was able to force a cataclysmic battle in modern-day Iraq on the plains of Arbela, where he destroyed the last remaining Persian army, and then by right of conquest became emperor of all of Persia.
It was said that Alexander's pedigree destined him for greatness, reputedly a descendant of Hercules on his father's side and Achilles on his mother's. Alexander's empire stretched from Greece to Egypt to modern-day Afghanistan, one of the largest the world has ever seen. But Alexander's appetite for power and glory was insatiable. 5 years after defeating the Persians, he was ready to confront a new enemy. He stood with his 32,000 battle-tested soldiers along the banks of the Indus River, poised for his next conquest, India.
It's been a busy 8 years for Alexander, who's not even 30 years old yet. He's now Emperor of Persia after defeating the mighty Persian Empire in a very bloody campaign. He's Pharaoh of Egypt. Didn't even have to raise a sword there, they just gave up. Now he's knocking on India's door.
From a geographic and tactical perspective, the problem is to get to India, you have to cross 2 major rivers, the Indus and the Hydaspes River.
For most commanders, these rivers would have seemed uncrossable. But not for Alexander, whose foresight and planning were legendary.
A couple of years in advance, 2 years in advance, he ordered shipwrights to come from the coastal area of Syria and to build boats to ferry his troops across the Indus River.
Once Alexander had crossed the Indus, he had to contend with King Ambi, ruler of Taxila. Taxila was the capital of Punjab, the country that sat between the Indus and the Hydaspes rivers.
Ambi can do one of 2 things. He can fight and see his city annihilated and probably get strung up. Alexander was known to have made examples out of opposition leaders with slow, painful, very public deaths. Or he can play ball, preserve his city, and maybe even save his throne.
Ambi wisely avoided confrontation. Alexander crossed the river and easily commandeered Taxila, turning it into a base of operations for his Indian invasion. The next hurdle was reaching and crossing the Hydaspes River, 100 miles away. But Alexander had anticipated this as well.
The army can't carry entire boats 100 miles across India to the Hydaspes. So they break them into parts and haul them piecemeal.
What they were these kind of collapsible boats where the frames could be built and the skins transported and the buckets of tar individually, and then when you're going to cross the river, you assemble them a couple of days in advance.
It took 2 months for Alexander to reach the Hydaspes River. He led 23,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry, a loyal, committed army. Many had been with Alexander from the beginning, drawn by the power of his personality and his dreams of glory.
They fought for honor and individual glory, and all their myths were of great warriors, from Agamemnon 1,000 years before to Achilles and Hercules. All of these are great warriors. They get everything because they're great warriors. So essentially, being a hero for Alexander, being a professional warrior, perpetually seeking more and more glory, I think psychologically became what amounted to a way of life.
Alexander's adversary across the Hydaspes River was an equally proud and brave warrior, the Indian king Porus of Pareva. Porus was descended from a long line of soldier kings. Well over 6 feet tall, he was a giant by the standards of the time.
In his usual style, Alexander first tries conquest by diplomacy. He sends for Porus and invites him to a meeting. Alexander's basically offering him a chance to avoid destruction if he pays tribute and gives up his throne peacefully.
Porus doesn't just refuse to surrender. He actually challenges the legendary Alexander the Great to fight. He says, "Yes, I'll meet you on the battlefield."
Porus was prepared to defend his kingdom at any cost.
Porus has under his command about 30,000 infantry troops, 2,000 cavalry, and 300 chariots. But he's got one thing that neither Alexander nor the Greeks have ever seen.
He had 200 war elephants, ready for battle.
The elephant was a highly developed instrument of war in the Indian army. It took about 10 years to train the elephant, and they were exceedingly well trained. They responded to name calls, they responded to whistles, and they fought.
So, if we imagine what's going on now, you have Porus on the far eastern side of the Hydaspes River, ready to oppose Alexander's crossing. On the western bank, you have Alexander's army. And in between flows a fairly wide, fairly deep, and fairly rapid Hydaspes River.
Alexander was faced with a significant challenge: how to get his 32,000-man army across the raging river while maintaining the critical element of surprise.
But how? If he just crosses right under Porus's nose, his troops are going to be sitting ducks. The Indian army will easily pick them off with their arrows midstream or when they try to reach the other side. So Alexander needs a tactical plan. And he puts into motion what will be an unbelievable game of cat and mouse with Porus.
When in doubt, deceive and dissemble. And he begins with the simple act of ordering up grain from his logistics supply lines. Grain shipments begin to arrive. And the reason for this is psychological. It's late spring, early summer.
What you conclude is that they have no intention of crossing until later in the campaign season, when the river's current and depth are lowered.
Having convinced Porus that the crossing wouldn't take place until the next season, Alexander mobilized his men.
The second piece of deception was to begin to move his elements of his army, mostly cavalry, but some infantry. He would march them up and down the riverbank, upstream, downstream, upstream, downstream. Initially, what does this tell you if you're Porus? He's looking for a place to cross. He may use it in the future, but he's looking for a place to cross. This is good. I'll find out where he's going to cross, and what I'll do is I'll deploy my forces against it. So Porus takes his army and starts following Alexander on the opposite bank.
Porus mirrored Greek troop movements with his entire force.
And then this goes on for a week or two, and Alexander always returns to camp, at which point Porus concludes that this is pointless. All right, he may be looking for a place to cross, but in any event, there's no need for me to move my entire army up and down the field. So what he does is, instead of doing that, he just posts pickets on the other side of the river.
This was exactly what Alexander intended. He then ordered his men to initiate the second phase of his well-planned campaign.
Their mission: light fires, make noise, draw attention to themselves every single night. What Alexander's doing, again, is he's conditioning Porus's army to the noise along the riverbank.
Alexander has now achieved a very important tactical advantage. What is that? The ability to move his army around on his side of the riverbank without provoking a major tactical response on the part of the enemy. In essence, he's lowered the anxiety level, lowered the attention level of Porus and his army.
Finally, after 2 months, under cover of darkness, Alexander led a contingent of troops away from his camp. Thanks to the preceding activities, Porus hardly noticed.
Alexander never intended on waiting to cross the river. Everything he's done up until now is to set up a scenario to cross the river without alerting the Indians, and thereby gain the tactical advantage.
It's absolutely brilliant. He already knows exactly where he's going to cross, and he's going to cross that night.
What he does, he takes a force of some 10,000 infantry and about 6,000 Greek cavalry and another 1,000 horse archers, light cavalry, and moves it up the bank 17 miles.
But Porus was not the only one to be caught out by the night crossing, for the Hydaspes River held some unpleasant surprises for Alexander too. 326 BC, Alexander the Great was about to lead nearly 20,000 soldiers across a raging river in India. A surprise attack had been 2 months in the making. Hours earlier, Alexander had led his force 17 miles north from his main camp, up the Hydaspes River to a crossing point. Alexander's army was a well-oiled, experienced fighting machine. For the better part of a decade, it had been improving and modernizing with each military encounter. One of the army's greatest challenges had come 3 years earlier against Central Asian nomads in the region around Bactria and Sogdiana, modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, provinces in the far east of Alexander's empire.
Alexander's problem with the provinces, the furthest provinces to the east, is that they're essentially not really nation states. What they really are is conglomerations of tribal, ethnic tribal units that are at each other's throats, much as they are today in modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so he sets out to essentially put down these revolts.
The Central Asians are nomadic pastoral tribes from around the Caspian Sea. They're excellent marksmen and they're tough. You have to be just to survive in the rugged mountains of Afghanistan.
They were masters of hit-and-run tactics. But Alexander and his men had not been trained or equipped to deal with this kind of attack. The Greek way had always been to move in unison, in a phalanx, several rows of interlocked warriors. But these Central Asian tribal guerrilla fighters included archers on horseback.
Everything about these horsemen is light and mobile. They harass the enemy with volleys of arrows or javelins, then they quickly retreat.
To counter this new threat, Alexander had restructured his army to bring these light cavalry archers into his force.
So in the end, he basically reconfigured his army, basically from Persian sources, making it much lighter, using Persian light infantry, some heavy, but mostly light infantry, and light cavalry.
This was the battle-tested, more mobile force with which Alexander intended to conquer India.
At the end of a 2-year guerrilla war in the eastern provinces and having achieved the modicum of success, Alexander now turns his covetous eyes further east to India.
But he knew he faced a formidable opponent. The Indian king's army had a long and bloody tradition. India at that time was divided into 16 regional kingdoms, each constantly fighting the others for dominance.
War was the normal state of affairs. As soon as a king gained power, he would begin attacking his neighbors.
India's tradition of warfare stretched back more than 1,000 years, to the arrival of the Aryan tribes of Central Eurasia.
This is one of the great migrations of history, and if you really want to see what these people look like, turn on your television set and look at Afghani tribesmen. That whole northern tier of mountains has had no genetic dilution at all since the 18th century. So that's what the Aryans look like. They were big, dark-eyed, bearded people who had the horse and the chariot. And so they made short work of conquering India.
Much about the Aryans is still debated among scholars. We do know that they were fierce warriors and that they're the ones who introduced the horse and the chariot to the Indian subcontinent.
Chariots brought mobility and speed to the battlefield and enabled the Aryans to conquer much of the subcontinent.
We also know that for about a millennium after the Aryans invade, India is ruled by a warrior class whose tribes are constantly at war with each other.
India possesses rich gold and metal deposits, so they have the resources and skills to produce weapons as sophisticated as any army of the time.
In the Ramayana, an Indian epic from the first few centuries BCE, the villain, Ravana, is pictured carrying 18 different weapons in as many hands. He's got a javelin, sickle sword, 3 different kinds of battle axes. You name it, he's got it. And that arsenal is representative of what the various Indian armies actually used at the time. The ancient Indian kingdoms had really perfected the art of war.
An art that King Porus had mastered. He was waiting to defend India against her latest invader, the Greek, Alexander. Porus believed he still had time to discover when Alexander would cross the Hydaspes, but he'd been duped. Alexander was already crossing, 17 miles upriver. 10,000 Greek infantry, 6,000 heavy cavalry, and 1,000 light Asian horse archers all hurled themselves into the wild river.
It's storming, it's the middle of the night, and it's cloudy, so it's pitch black, and they're just plunging into these violent waters almost blindly. Absolutely terrifying.
The raging current buffeted the Greeks' flimsy collapsible boats, and soldiers used straw-filled goatskin bags to stay afloat.
Horses would either swim after you or being led after you by their reins, and it's at night, and so it's a night crossing of a river, and it's a pretty difficult maneuver. Worse, it starts to rain, and the wind starts to blow. There's a tremendous thunderstorm going on, which is really to Alexander's advantage because it keeps the noise down and it keeps Porus's pickets under cover.
Alexander was certain that he'd chosen his crossing point wisely. But what he thought was the far bank of the river was actually an island.
He crosses the river, gains the island, crosses the island in a narrow defile where he can hide his troops from Porus, and discovers to his horror that's not the other bank. It's not the far bank, it's just another island.
Hidden behind the first island, they discovered another island. The Greeks still had 2 more crossings ahead of them, and time was running out.
Alexander has made one of the few tactical errors of his career here. When he scouted the crossing point, he didn't send swimmers all the way across. He just saw an island and the far bank behind it. It turned out that what he saw was not the far bank, but simply another island.
So now, God, what are we going to do? It's too deep. So we go up and down the island until they find a place to cross where the water is chest deep. And they cross chest deep water, swimming, dragging their equipment to another island, and then finally to another island. But by dawn, cold, hungry, and soaking wet, they gain the other bank within a very short time. The pickets pick it up, and a rider is sent to Porus. And so Alexander has successfully made the crossing, and he's moving in force against you.
Now Porus faces a dilemma. His scouts say Alexander had crossed the Hydaspes, but across the river from his camp is a large Greek force.
Cleverly, Alexander had divided his troops the previous night. Some 15,000 had crossed the river, but 12,000 had stayed back at camp.
This is called a fixing or a pinning force. It keeps Porus in place because he has no idea whether Alexander's is the main force or a feint.
If he moves to deal with this feint, then the main force crosses right in front of him, catching him between a hammer and anvil. Or is this the main attack?
Faced with this dilemma, Porus decided to launch only a small force to confront the Greek contingent that had crossed the river to the north.
By keeping his main force in place, he's basically hedged his bet into thinking the main Greek force is still right in front of him and across the river, and what's coming is a smaller force.
Porus sent only half of his 4,000 heavy cavalry and 200 of his 300 chariots north to meet the enemy. That force was commanded by Porus' son, also named Porus. Simultaneously, Alexander mustered his exhausted men and advanced south, leading with his heavy cavalry. Behind them were light Asian horse archers, and then the infantry. But as soon as Alexander caught sight of Porus' advance force of heavy cavalry and chariots, he halted, and despite the immense pressure on the battlefield, reconfigured his troops.
Alexander is brilliant at knowing exactly how and when to change his attack or defense at a moment's notice. He sees how Porus' army is configured and immediately withdraws his heavy cavalry. Heavy cavalry against chariots and other heavy cavalry does not give him the best advantage.
What would be better tactically is to send his light cavalry to harass and stop the movement of the army. That's what he does. He sends in his Iranian horse archers. It's a trick he learned from fighting these very same people in the eastern approaches of the Persian Empire.
Alexander's light cavalry collided with young Porus' small force. And with that, the Battle of the Hydaspes River had begun. (336 BC), the Battle of the Hydaspes River, one of ancient history's most brutal battles, had begun. Alexander the Great's light infantry showered the approaching Indians with volleys of arrows. The Greek archers used a light composite bow crafted from animal horn and layered with sinew from the legs of wild deer or antelope.
The MO for Alexander's horse archers is hit and run, hit and run. They don't wear armor, they don't really need to, they don't get close enough to the enemy to need it, and here they actually don't need it because the Indians don't have archers.
Their heads were protected by thick cotton turbans, their torsos by a surprisingly strong quilted armor.
It was probably like a modern-day flak jacket, which you would imagine, two layers of cotton, perhaps, or even wool, and in between those layers would be raw, unprocessed cotton. Well, believe it or not, the fibers of raw, unprocessed cotton are sufficient to stop an arrow.
Alexander's horse archers stripped the Indians of their mobility.
Their object is to take the steam out of the Indian cavalry attack and force them together. That's exactly what happens.
Once they're gathered together, almost immobile, that's when Alexander commits his heavy squadrons of heavy Greek cavalry, and they just smash right through the gathered Indian cavalry scattered.
The Copis was designed with a forward-sloping blade for maximum impact on a downward strike. Once a butcher's tool, it was just as effective on humans. The Indian chariot archers released a torrent of arrows against Alexander's infantry. But a small wooden shield covered with bronze protected the Greek soldiers. Some Indian arrows took their toll, but battlefield conditions favored Alexander.
The rain the night before makes the battlefield a mud pit. These heavy chariots cannot maneuver their iron-shod wheels. They're absolutely useless in the mud.
The Indians were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Almost 500 Indian cavalrymen were killed.
The chariots apparently never got into the battle, or if they did, they were completely ineffective. And they would be ineffective, essentially, against cavalry that could ride around it.
Among the dead was young Porus.
So Alexander has essentially now destroyed and brushed aside that reconnaissance force that Porus has sent.
The survivors retreat back to the senior Porus's camp. They tell him his son is dead, and that Alexander is indeed leading the main force. And they're heading this way.
By now, Porus had realized that the Greek contingent across the river was just a feint, intended to confuse him.
What Porus does at this point, he's still in danger of a cross-river attack, so he leaves a strong rear guard there to deal with that attack if it comes. He pulls the rest of the army out of the camp and starts to move it upstream to meet Alexander. About 3 hours later, they stop at a good battle site.
And what the texts say is that a place where he found the first firm ground is where Porus deployed his army. Why would he be looking for firm ground? Well, there were two reasons. One is he had 200 chariots at his disposal. The second thing is elephants. Elephants are heavy, and you don't want them slipping and sliding all over the battlefield.
While Porus deployed his army, a few miles to the north, Alexander picked up reinforcements. Before crossing the Hydaspes, he had stationed a reserve force midway between his main camp and the crossing point.
So he hadn't divided his army into two the night before. He divided it into three forces, and these reserves of about 4,500 infantry and 3,000 cavalry are fresh troops. They've gotten some sleep, they've marched half as far as Alexander's force, and they haven't seen combat yet.
The reinforcements crossed the river and joined Alexander's contingent.
So now, when you look at the force strength that Alexander commands, somewhere in the vicinity of 8,000 cavalry and somewhere in the vicinity of perhaps 15 or 16,000 infantry.
But Alexander's men were too spread out. The cavalry was in front, with the exhausted infantry dragging hours behind.
So as Alexander approaches the battlefield, sees Porus's army, he's in a situation where he has to delay the battle. How do you do that? He takes his Iranian horse archers and throws them forward, and they begin riding up and down the line, shooting arrows.
Now is the time when Porus should have attacked. Maybe he wasn't ready. Maybe he wasn't in an aggressive frame of mind. We don't know. But it looks like he was going to accept the battle that Alexander presented.
Porus' decision to hold back meant the Greek infantry had time to catch up, while Alexander studied the formation of the Indian troops. In front, a line of 200 battle-tested war elephants. Behind the elephants, an even longer line of 30,000 infantry. And on each wing, a brigade of 1,000 cavalry to protect the flanks.
Alexander's infantry is outnumbered 2 to 1, so what he wants to do is turn this into a cavalry fight rather than an infantry fight. There's one problem: elephants.
Roman historian Curtius captured the scene. The beasts, stationed between lines of armed men, at a distance looked like towers, while Porus himself had almost exceeded the measure of human stature. The beast on which he rode seemed to add to his height.
The Greek Macedonians had never seen them in large numbers. Now, the individual fighting men wasn't too much of a problem. It was the horses. The horses had no exposure to these elephants, and the smell and sound and sight of them panicked the Macedonian cavalry.
If he was to use his cavalry effectively, Alexander had to revise his tactical plan, or this battle, and his best chance of conquering India, would be lost. Alexander had achieved a difficult night crossing of the Hydaspes River. And defeated a small Indian advance force. He then had to launch his attack against the full might of the main Indian army.
The Indian infantry is twice as large as the Greeks. Alexander knows his strength as cavalry, where he outnumbers Porus 4-1. So the game is now how to fight a battle that's not an infantry battle.
Alexander had this phenomenal ability to very quickly read a battlefield and formulate a strategy to gain the advantage.
Alexander deployed his 4,000-strong cavalry towards Porus' left flank. The Indian king had a total of only 2,000 cavalry, 1,000 on each wing. Porus ordered his cavalry on the right wing to pull out of position, ride behind the battle line, and reinforce the left. And that was the mistake Alexander had been waiting for. Alexander ordered Conus, one of his commanders, and 2,000 of his cavalry that had been advancing towards Porus' left flank to change direction and attack the defenseless right.
The 2,000 horsemen arrive on the right wing. There's nobody to fight. They turn the corner and ride all the way behind the Indian positions. It's a bizarre situation that's all but been brought about by Alexander's tactical brilliance.
As Conus and the Greek cavalry rode behind the Indian lines, Alexander ordered his horse archers to bombard the Indian cavalry with volley after volley. Alexander then rode out with his elite brigade of 2,000 cavalry, swinging wide right and out past Porus' left flank.
What Porus does is he did what any commander would do. He tries to extend his left flank. So he takes his left wing and he says, redeploy further to the left, which means they come out of their positions, they turn in column of march, and they begin to move out to the left to prevent the envelopment.
As the Indians began to march to the left, and with Conus also on the move, Alexander changed direction again. Instead of sweeping around Porus' left flank, he suddenly turned inward and cut off the left wing from the main body of the army.
At the same time, Conus, who was ridden all the way around the battlefield, arrives at what we call the Schwerpunkt, or the critical point in the battle, and bang, slams into the left wing of Porus' army.
Alexander had Porus exactly where he wanted it. His left wing shattered, his cavalry destroyed.
Alexander always seems, whenever every battle that he fought, always seemed to be at the crucial point where the tactic shifted. The crucial point where instead of going out, he turned in, where he went through the gap or instead of around the gap. How you do that and at the same time be right out there with your guys is a rare talent.
Alexander then moved his heavy infantry against the Indian center. But Porus wasn't about to capitulate, and he ordered his archers to attack. The Indian bow was 6 feet of strong, flexible bamboo. To extend it fully, the archer had to anchor the bow in the ground and steady it with his foot. Its tremendous size gave it unparalleled firepower. Its arrows with sharp bone or metal heads could penetrate any armor. But because of the weather, the archers were ineffective.
It was raining the night before, and all those thousands of horses and men and elephants, they turned the ground to mud. The Indian army wasn't used to fighting during the rainy season. Its archers couldn't anchor their bows. Huge blow to Porus. He'd lost one of his most powerful weapons.
With his left wing destroyed, Porus' army was reduced to his infantry, his war-trained armored elephants, and their archers.
You didn't just fight the elephant. The elephant on top was what they call a howdah, which was an archer or spear platform, but they deployed with a squad of 13 infantry around them, the same way we'd use infantry to protect tanks today.
But the elephants did have one soft spot, their eyes, which the Greek infantry soldiers targeted.
I can imagine what would happen if an elephant's blinded in the eye. I mean, he just goes crazy. I mean, an elephant's an exceedingly big animal.
Through the chaos, Alexander pummeled the Indian center and pulverized its flank. Despite being trapped in a deadly two-sided attack, Porus fought on.
The center is collapsing on itself into a giant gaggle of 10, 12,000 men, animals, chariots, donkeys, horses, whatever. They literally can't move, and the infantry is pressing against them. The cavalry is pressing from the side. In these kinds of battles, as long as you're maneuvering on the open plain, you don't take a lot of casualties. But when you close into close combat, it gets horrifically bloody because you can't maneuver. You can't even run away. I mean, the problem at the Battle of the Hidispus was you couldn't get away. 10,000 human beings pressed by another 8,000 human beings in a cauldron of slaughter. The screams of animals, the trumpeting call of a wounded elephant, for example, the whinny of a horse in pain. And remember, if you fell down, if a horse slipped and went down or was wounded, or if a man fell off there were no saddles, but fell off the horse, he'd be trampled to death.
Human beings being stabbed, being hacked at. The noise and the screams in the battlefield becomes quickly covered with blood, gore, and entrails, pieces of human flesh.
And the smell. The smell. I mean, elephants, when they're wounded, like many animals, defecate. And you can imagine that as well. The noise and the smell and the human horror, absolutely terrific.
About 7 hours after the battle had begun, the Indian army was nearly destroyed, though Porus himself survived.
They're not completely destroyed, but probably 3/4 of the army is killed. Porus himself, badly wounded, continues to fight on.
Alexander admired Porus' bravery and determination to keep fighting in the face of certain defeat.
Alexander recognizes in Porus a kindred warrior spirit. He doesn't want to kill the man he's grown to respect, so he sends a messenger to call him for a meeting.
Greek historian Arrian recorded the conversation. Alexander was the first to speak. "What," he said, "do you wish that I should do with you?" "Treat me as a king ought," Porus famously replied.
Alexander is so impressed with Porus' dignity and composure, he decides to let him remain as king and keep his territories and his subjects.
So at the end of the day, Alexander, at the Battle of the Hidispus River, shows his tactical brilliance. I mean, this is a guy who can read a battlefield. He has what Napoleon called the coup d'oeil, the strike of the eye. By looking at the terrain, looking at the arrangement of forces, is able to devise very quickly, in this case, a tactical plan that plays to his own advantage.
With his victory at Hydaspes, Alexander the Great had taken his first step across the Indian frontier. But it was a fleeting victory. As the Greeks advanced deeper into India, several states set aside their own rivalries to stand united against the invader. At the next battle site, Alexander was confronted by 300,000 Indian troops.
In attempting to conquer India, you get the feeling that perhaps Alexander's strategic intelligence analysis was not as good as it had been in the past, because any reasonable view of what was going on in India at the time would have led you to the conclusion that this would be an almost impossible military task for what amounts to a small Greek army.
By this time, Alexander's men could see that their leader's quest had become a suicide mission. They'd been fighting long and hard, and mutiny was in the air.
He tries to rally them to keep going. He's inspirational, his troops are loyal, but they've just had enough.
Alexander, always attuned to his men, surrendered to their will and turned south, returning to Babylon in modern-day Iraq. But his eastern adventure may have cost him his life.
The best guess is that he died of malaria, in Babylon, where history says, or at least the texts say, because he was considered to be Pharaoh of Egypt. His body was sent to Egypt, where it was embalmed, and put in a crystal casket.
Alexander the Great, one of history's most brilliant military tacticians, dead at 33. The conqueror of much of the known world, his record and his leadership skills still stand as the inspiration for great military minds.
During the first Gulf War in 1991, General Norman Schwarzkopf took a page out of Alexander the Great's playbook with his left hook strategy.
Like Alexander, Schwarzkopf essentially feigned a main attack on the Iraqi forces occupying Kuwait from the south. But the bulk of his force, modern-day heavy cavalry, tanks, swung hundreds of miles due west and came at the Iraqis' right flank.
There's the left hook, effectively knocking out the Iraqi army. Ground war in Operation Desert Storm was over in 100 hours. That is a successful feign and envelop that Alexander would be proud of.
Alexander the Great campaigned for more than 11 years over 20,000 miles and never lost a battle. Still, he was dissatisfied.
It is one of the more interesting questions of history, of having achieved all of the strategic objectives that he set out to be, against all odds, by the way. Why does Alexander continue to literally want more? Why is it not enough? And I think he's a very curious character psychologically, but basically I think he's a very traditional Greek. You know, when you look at the history of Greece, Greek soldiers didn't fight for strategic reasons or even political goals. I mean, that's something that comes in much later. All right, because there's no sense of being Greek. There's no Greek nation per se. So what did they fight for? They fought for honor and individual glory.
A forger of empires with an unquenchable thirst for glory, Alexander spread Greek culture throughout the known world, yet died wanting more.